The curtains were drawn against the autumn light at Enderby Hall, a vast Victorian mansion that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. Old Lanscombe, the butler, shuffled through the rooms, his rheumy eyes misting over as he prepared for the family to return from the funeral. His master, Richard Abernethie, was dead. He had been a strong, vital man, the last pillar of a wealthy dynasty, and his sudden passing marked the end of an era. The family that gathered in the green drawing room was a fractured collection of strangers, bound only by blood and the anticipation of an inheritance. There was Timothy, the hypochondriac brother, who hadn't visited in years, nursing his imaginary ailments, his capable, bossy wife, Maud. The younger generation, nieces and nephews, like the efficient Susan, the beautiful but vague Rosamond, and the shifty George. And then there was Cora. Cora Lansquenet had always been the wild card of the family, the painter who married beneath her, the eccentric who said exactly what she thought. Dressed in wispy black with inappropriate jet beads, she looked like a bird of ill omen. After a somber lunch, the family gathered to hear the will. It was a fair distribution of wealth, a relief to everyone present. But as the tension eased and polite conversation resumed, Cora tilted her head to the side, looking at them with a childlike, wide-eyed innocence. "But he was murdered, wasn't he?" she asked brightly. The silence that followed was absolute. The family stared at her, shocked. Cora fluttered, seemingly embarrassed by her own outburst, murmuring that she thought she just assumed. Because Richard had died so suddenly, the moment was smoothed over, laughed off as typical Cora, and the family dispersed, eager to return to their own lives and their new fortunes. But the seed of doubt had been planted. The very next day, the unease turned into horror. Mr. Entwistle, the family solicitor, received a call from the police. Cora Lansquenet was dead. She had been brutally murdered in her lonely cottage, hacked to death with a hatchet in her sleep. Mr. Entwistle, a man of caution and precision, felt a chill run through him. Cora had claimed Richard was murdered. Now Cora herself was dead. It could be a coincidence, a burglary gone wrong, a wandering tramp. But the timing was terrifying. If Richard Abernethie had been silenced, and Cora knew something about it, then she had been silenced too. Driven by a sense of duty to his old friend, Entwistle knew this was beyond his depth. He needed a mind that could see through the tangle of family lies and secrets. He turned to Hercule Poirot. The legendary detective arrived at Enderby Hall, but not as himself. He assumed the guise of Monsieur Pontarlier, a representative for a refugee organization interested in buying the mansion. It was a clever ruse that allowed him to observe the family in their natural habitat as they returned to the house to sort through their possessions. He found a family riddles with secrets. Susan and her husband Greg were dangerously ambitious, and Greg seemed unstable, almost hysterical. George was desperate for money to cover his gambling debts. Rosamond and her husband Michael needed capital for their stage careers. Everyone had a motive to want Richard dead, and perhaps to fear what Cora might have known. But the violence wasn't over. Cora's companion, a timid, chatty woman named Miss Gilchrist, had moved in with the family after the tragedy. She was a woman who lived on the periphery, a domestic creature who dreamed of one day owning a tea shop. But terror followed her. She received a package in the mail, a piece of wedding cake. Touched by what she thought was a kindness, she ate it, only to fall violently ill. The cake was laced with arsenic. Poirot watched the family closely. Tension was breaking them apart. Accusations flew. Greg confessed to the murder of Richard Abernethie, but Poirot saw through it as the ravings of a man seeking punishment for past sins, not the truth of this crime. Then came the breaking point. Helen Abernethie, the widow of Richard's beloved brother Leo, began to piece together a fragmented memory. She realized that on the day of the funeral, when Cora had asked her shocking question, something about Cora had felt wrong. Not what she said, but how she looked. Helen called Mr. Entwistle, her voice trembling with the dawn of realization. She had just started to explain when a heavy blow struck her down. She was found unconscious, the victim of a vicious attack within the sanctuary of Enderby Hall. The time for masquerades was over. Poirot dropped his disguise. He gathered the terrified and suspicious family in the great library, just as they had gathered for the reading of the will. The air was thick with fear. They knew a killer stood among them. Poirot began to weave the threads together. He spoke of the oil paint smell in Cora's cottage, of a missing Vermeer painting that had been disguised as a crude sketch, and of the nature of mirrors. He turned the room's attention to the day of the funeral. He revealed a stunning truth. Richard Abernethie had died of natural causes. There was no murder at Enderby Hall, at least not initially. The crime was never about Richard. It was always about Cora. He explained Helen's intuition. When Cora had tilted her head to ask, "He was murdered, wasn't he?" She had tilted it the wrong way. A mirror image mimics us in reverse. The woman at the funeral had practiced Cora's mannerisms in a mirror, forgetting that to the observer, the gesture would look opposite. The woman at the funeral was not Cora Lansquenet. Cora was already dead before the funeral began. The woman who stood among them that day, playing the role of the eccentric aunt, mimicking her voice and dropping the bombshell about murder to create confusion, was the timid, overlooked companion, Miss Gilchrist. A gasp went through the room. Miss Gilchrist, the tea-shop dreamer, sat freezing in her chair. Poirot laid it out mercilessly. Miss Gilchrist, an amateur artist, had recognized a masterpiece, a Vermeer, hidden beneath a dirty varnish among Cora's junk shop finds. It was worth thousands. It was the capital she needed for her Willow Tree tea shop, but Cora wouldn't sell. So, Miss Gilchrist killed her with a hatchet, then impersonated her at the funeral to establish that Cora was alive days after she was actually dead, throwing the police timeline into chaos. The murder remark was a stroke of genius, or madness, calculated to make the family suspect each other and distract from the robbery of the painting. The arsenic in the wedding cake was a self-inflicted ploy to divert suspicion away from herself. Miss Gilchrist did not deny it. In fact, she seemed almost relieved to speak of it. With a chilling calmness, she explained that she simply had to have the money. She had endured a life of drudgery and service, and the painting was her ticket to dignity. She spoke not of the lives she took, but of the tea shop she would never open, of the oak tables and the red and white checked curtains. As the police led the little woman away, the Abernethie family was left in the silence of the great hall. The shadow of suspicion lifted, but the tragedy remained. They were free of the killer, but they had seen the darkness that lay within the human heart, where a dream of a cozy tea shop could drive a quiet woman to the most brutal of crimes.